The day my son-in-law showed up at my door with a stranger in a suit and a manila folder under his arm, I already knew exactly what was inside it. I just didn't let him know that. My name is Russell Adler. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county, fixing bridges and drainage systems that most people never thought about until they flooded. I retired at 62 with a decent pension, a paid-off house in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and more peace and quiet than I'd had in decades. My wife, Peggy, passed 6 years ago, a stroke sudden and cruel, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you should have said a long time ago. After she was gone, it was just me, the house, my vegetable garden, and my daughter, Simone. Simone was 34 when she met Derek Wills at a friend's birthday party in Morgantown. She called me the next morning, which was unusual for a Sunday, and she was laughing in that breathless way she used to laugh when she was a teenager, and something had genuinely caught her off guard. She said, "Dad, I think I met someone." I was happy for her. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely happy. The first time she brought Derek to my house for dinner, he walked through the front door, shook my hand, and spent the first 20 minutes asking about the neighborhood. Not in the way a person does when they're making conversation, more like a buyer walking through an open house. He asked what the property taxes were. He asked whether I'd done anything to the foundation recently. He asked how old the roof was. I told him the roof was replaced in 2019. I told him the taxes. I answered his questions because I was trying to be polite and because Simone was watching me with those hopeful eyes that made it impossible to be anything other than warm. But I filed every one of those questions away somewhere in the back of my mind, the way you file away the sound a pipe makes before it bursts. Over the next several months, I watched Derek carefully. He was charming when he needed to be. He laughed at the right moments, remembered to compliment Simone in front of me, always brought something when he came over. A 6-pack of beer, a pie from the bakery on Jefferson Street. He was good at the performance of being a decent man. I'll give him that. What bothered me wasn't what he said. It was what he kept circling back to. Twice over dinner he mentioned that a house like mine, in a neighborhood like this, must be worth something significant now. He said it casually, like a passing thought. But there's no such thing as a passing thought when someone says the same passing thought twice. The third time he brought up the house, framed as a comment about how smart Peggy and I had been to buy when we did. I excused myself to get more water from the kitchen, stood at the sink for about 10 seconds, and made a decision. I called my attorney the following Monday. His name is Gene Whitmore, and I've known him since we were both in our 40s, and he helped me fight a boundary dispute with a neighbor who thought the survey markers were suggestions. Gene is the kind of lawyer who doesn't waste words. I told him I had a situation I wanted to get ahead of. I told him about Derek. I told him about the questions. Gene said, "What are you thinking?" I said I wanted to put the house in an irrevocable trust. There was a pause on the line. Then Gene said, "Russell, you know what that means. Once it's in the trust, you can't pull it back out. The terms are fixed." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I want to do it." We spent 3 weeks working through the details. The trust named Simone as the sole beneficiary, meaning the house would pass to her cleanly when I died, but crucially, and this was the part Gene made sure I understood inside and out, no one could transfer, sell, or encumber the property without the trustee's approval. I named Gene himself as trustee. The house was no longer mine to give away. It also wasn't mine to have taken. By the time we finalized everything and recorded it with the county, Derek Wills had been in my daughter's life for about 8 months. I didn't tell Simone. Not yet. I told myself I didn't want to poison the relationship before I had real evidence of anything. But if I'm being honest with myself, and I've had plenty of time to be honest with myself since all this happened, part of me was also hoping I was wrong about Derek. Part of me wanted to sit down a year later and laugh at my own suspicion. Simone got engaged the following spring. She called me on a Thursday evening, and she was crying, but the good kind of crying, the kind that sounds like laughing with water in it. She said Derek had taken her to Blackwater Falls State Park, a place she'd loved since she was a girl, and proposed on the overlook at sunset. I told her I was thrilled. I told her Derek was a lucky man. Both of those things were true. in their own way. The wedding was planned for October, 11 months out. In that time, I watched Derek shift. It was subtle at first. He started coming around the house more often, sometimes without Simone, always with a reason. He needed to borrow a tool. He wanted to drop something off. Once he came by just to ask if I'd thought about what I was going to do with the house long term. Whether I'd considered moving somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't require so much upkeep. I was 68 years old. My house was 3 bedrooms and roughly 1,900 square feet. I grew tomatoes in the back and kept the gutters clean. I did not require assisted living. I told him I was comfortable where I was. He smiled and said, of course, just thinking ahead. There it was again, just a passing thought. About 4 months before the wedding, Simone called me on a Sunday afternoon. She sounded strange. Not upset exactly, more like she was trying to work something out while she was talking. Dad, she said, Derek mentioned something to me. About the house. I kept my voice even. What about it? He said. And I want to make sure I understand this right. He said that you told him you were thinking about giving us the house as an early inheritance. Signing it over after the wedding. Is that true? I sat down slowly on the couch. Simone, I said, I have never said anything like that to Derek. Not once. Not even close. There was a long silence. He seemed really sure about it, she said finally, and I could hear her trying to find a way to make both things true at once, the way you do when you love someone and the alternative is too ugly to look at. I'm sure he did, I said, but that conversation never happened. We didn't fight about it. Simone said she'd talked to him, and I believe she did, because Derek called me 2 days later and apologized. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he might have gotten ahead of himself. He was smooth about it, I'll give him that. He made it sound like a miscommunication between 2 reasonable people rather than what it actually was, which was a trial balloon. He'd wanted to know whether Simone would push back, whether she'd go to me, whether I'd say anything. Now he knew. After that call, I telephoned Gene again. The trust is solid, I asked. Ironclad, he said. Nothing moves without me. Good, I said. I think we may need it. The wedding was in October, at a vineyard outside of Morgantown. The day was cold and clear, the leaves were peak color, and Simone was the most beautiful I'd ever seen her. She looked the way her mother looked in our wedding photos, that particular combination of happy and terrified that only happens once in your life. I walked her down the aisle on grass that was still damp from rain the night before, and I handed her to Derek Wills, and I smiled the whole time. I kept smiling through the reception, through the toasts and the first dance and the cake. Derek's parents were there. His father Lyle barely spoke to me, and his mother Annette talked entirely too much, mostly about property values and how the Morgantown market was really something these days. At one point she leaned over to me and said, Derek tells me you have a beautiful place in Clarksburg. We'll have to come see it sometime, I said, anytime. It was 11 days after the wedding. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the tomato cages when I heard a car in the driveway. I came around the side of the house and saw Derek getting out of his car. Behind him, a second car was pulling in, a gray sedan, and the man who climbed out was wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. Derek saw me and put his hands in his jacket pockets in that casual way that's actually not casual at all. Russell, he said. Good, you're here. We need to talk. The man in the suit introduced himself. His name was Alan Corey and he was a notary public. He said he was there to notarize a document. He said it as though this were routine. As though notaries showed up in people's backyards on Tuesday afternoons all the time. Derek pulled a document from the inside of his jacket. He held it out to me like it was something I'd ordered. It's a quitclaim deed, he said. Simone and I have decided that the arrangement makes the most sense for everyone. The house transfers to us. We take over the carrying costs. You move into Sunrise Meadows over on Route 50. It's a great facility, Russell. We've already talked to them. They have availability. I looked at the quitclaim deed in his hand. I looked at Alan Corey, who was doing his very best not to make eye contact with me. I looked back at Derek, and then I did something I had been waiting 11 days to do, which was that I smiled at my son-in-law with complete and total calm. Derek, I said, I'm going to need you to listen to me very carefully because I'm only going to say this once. He cocked his head slightly, He expected arguments. He expected me to get flustered or upset. He had planned for denial, and he had planned for anger. He had not planned for calm. That house, I said, pointing toward my front door, has been in an irrevocable trust for the past 16 months. It was placed there by my attorney, Gene Whitmore, who serves as trustee. I have no legal authority to sign a quitclaim deed on this property. Neither does anyone else without the trustee's consent. You could bring 10 notaries out here, and it wouldn't matter. There is nothing to sign. Derek's expression didn't change right away. It took about 4 or 5 seconds, which is actually a long time when you're watching someone's face. Then it changed. He stopped. Started again. You're saying you put the house in a trust. 16 months ago, I said. About 3 weeks after the first time you asked me what my property taxes were. The color left his face the way water drains out of a tub, not all at once, but steadily, until there's nothing left. Alan Corey cleared his throat. Sir, he said to Derek very quietly, perhaps we should. Hold on, Derek said. He was looking at me with something new in his eyes now. Not the smooth, social expression he'd been wearing since the day I met him. Something rawer. You planned this. I did, I said. I planned it the way a man plans for a storm. You look at the sky. You read the weather. You make sure your roof is solid before the rain comes. Derek took a breath. He tried to find his footing. You don't. This isn't. Simone agreed to this arrangement. No, I said. Simone did not agree to this arrangement. Simone was told a version of events that wasn't true. That was your doing, not hers. I'd ask you to be careful about what you say next. He looked at me for a long moment. Then I said, there's one more thing. I reached into the pocket of my jacket. I'd had it in there since I came around the corner of the house, and I held up my phone. 6 weeks ago, I said. I hired a private investigator named Dale Bowman out of Fairmont. What Dale found is that you have 3 credit card accounts that Simone doesn't know about, carrying about $41,000 in debt. He also found that you were served with a judgment lien in Harrison County last year for an unpaid personal loan. And he found that you told Simone's friend, Amy, at a birthday party 2 months ago that you had a plan for how you and Simone were going to set yourselves up in the next year. Derek's jaw tightened. All of that is in a file, I said, that I emailed to my attorney and to Simone's email address at 6:30 this morning. He didn't say anything. Derek, I said, I'd like you and Mr. Corey to leave my property now. If you come back without an invitation, I'll call the sheriff's department and I'll show them the quitclaim deed you brought here today. My attorney believes that presenting a fraudulent transfer document to an elderly homeowner may constitute elder financial abuse under West Virginia law. That carries serious criminal exposure. So I would strongly suggest you think carefully about your next move. Alan Corey had already taken 3 steps toward his car. He wanted no part of any of this, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. Derek stood there for a moment. He was doing the thing people do when they realize the game is over and they're trying to figure out how to exit with some piece of dignity intact. There wasn't a good exit. He'd walked into a situation he'd spent a year constructing and found it had already been dismantled, down to the studs, before he ever arrived. He put the quitclaim deed back inside his jacket. He said, "You're going to regret this." "I regret a lot of things," I said. "This won't be one of them." He got in his car and left. I stood in my driveway for a while after both cars were gone. The October light was coming through the maple at the edge of the yard and landing on the side of the house in patches, the way it does when the leaves have just started to thin. I'd stood in this driveway for 30 years. I knew exactly what this light looked like in October. Peggy used to say that the best time to fix a problem is before the problem arrives. She meant it about the garden, about getting the beds ready in fall so spring doesn't catch you off guard. But she was that way about most things. She thought ahead. She didn't panic. She just looked at the season coming and made quiet preparations. I thought about her a lot that afternoon. Simone called me at 2 o'clock. She had seen the email. She had read the file. She had also apparently received a phone call from Derek on his way out of my driveway. His version of events, which I gathered was not particularly accurate. She was crying. Not the good kind this time. "Dad," she said, and that was all she said for a long moment. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. How long have you known?" "Known for certain?" "Today." Suspected? Since the third time he asked about my property taxes at the dinner table. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. This was the question I had been turning over since long before any of this happened. The question I'd asked myself on the drive home from Jean's office after we filed the trust paperwork. The question I didn't have a perfect answer for. Because I hoped I was wrong, I said. And because if I'd told you, you'd have had to choose between believing me and believing someone you loved. I didn't want to put that on you before there was something real to put in front of you. She was quiet for a while. The house was never at risk, I said. I want you to know that. You were always going to inherit it. That was never the question. The question was whether Derek was going to be the reason you got it sooner. I feel so stupid, she said. You're not stupid, I said. You fell in love. He was careful about who he was in front of you. That's not your failure, Simone. That's his. It took time. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect these stories to have clean endings where the truth comes out and everyone immediately knows what to do next. That's not how it works. Simone didn't file her for divorce the next afternoon. She spent 3 weeks staying with her friend Amy, then 2 weeks in the house she and Derek had been renting. Derek hired an attorney. There were conversations I wasn't part of. There were nights she didn't call me, and I didn't call her because I thought she needed space to figure out what she believed. But she called. She always called, eventually. That's the thing about a relationship built over 30-some years. It has a different kind of root system than one built in 18 months. When Derek pulled on it, it didn't come up. She filed for divorce 8 weeks after that Tuesday in October. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt out of Clarksburg, who Jean recommended, handled the filing. Because Derek had hidden financial accounts and debts from Simone during the marriage, and because of the documented attempt to transfer property using a fraudulent claim of consent, Patricia was able to negotiate a settlement that left Derek with very little leverage. He walked away from the marriage with what he came into it with, which wasn't much. The judgment lien from Harrison County followed him out the door. He did not go to Sunrise Meadows on Route 50. I stayed in my house in Clarksburg, which was where I had always intended to stay. Winter came. I put the garden to bed the way I do every year, cutting back the dead growth, turning the soil, covering the beds with straw. Work you do in the cold so that something good can happen when it warms up again. In February, Simone came over on a Sunday, and we made chili from a recipe that was Peggy's originally, one that requires 3 kinds of bean, and an argument about whether you add the cornbread batter before or after you put it in the oven. We argued about the cornbread. I said before, she said after, and she was right, which I admitted. We ate at the kitchen table, where she'd eaten 10,000 meals growing up. And we didn't talk about Derek much. We talked about her job. We talked about a trip she was thinking about, taking to see a college roommate in Portland. We talked about whether I needed to replace the water heater, which I probably do. At some point she put her fork down and looked at me and said, I want you to know that I believe you. About all of it. I should have called you when he told me about the house. I should have called you right then. I said, you were trying to be a good wife. She said, I should have been a better daughter first. I didn't have a good answer for that. I'm not sure there is one. I think she was trying to love 2 people at once, and found out that one of them had made that impossible. That's not a moral failure, that's just an awful thing to discover about someone. I told her that the house would still be hers someday. That nothing about that had changed. The trust was still there, Jean was still trustee, and when the time came, it would pass to her exactly as I'd intended, without anyone else's signature required, without anyone standing in a driveway with a manila folder. She said, I know, Dad. And then she said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, Mom would have liked that you did it this way. Quiet, no big speech. Just, already done. She was right, Peggy would have approved of that. She always said the loudest thing you can do is fix something, before anyone else notices it was ever broken. I've thought about Derek Wills since then. Not often, but occasionally. I think about the version of the plan he must have had in his head, how clean it must have looked on paper. Elderly widower, 1 adult daughter, paid-off house, no suspicion. Easy. except that none of it was what he thought it was. The man he thought he was dealing with was not the man who answered the door. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't have speeches in me. What I have is 31 years of looking at structures and understanding where the weak points are, and knowing that the time to reinforce them is long before anyone tries to push on them. Derek Wills pushed. The house didn't move. I pulled the last of the frost cover off the garden beds in March, a little earlier than usual because the winter had been mild. I turned the soil, which was darker and richer than it looks like it should be this far into the season. I planted onion sets and garlic, and the early lettuce that Peggy always said was too much trouble for too little payoff, and that I've planted every year since she died because she was wrong about that, and also because it means something to me to prove her wrong about small things when I can. Simone came by that afternoon and helped me string the row markers. She didn't know much about gardening. She'd never had the patience for it when she was young, but she was learning. She asked the right questions. She got dirt on her jeans and didn't complain about it. We worked until it got too cold to be comfortable, and then we went inside and I made coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table and everything was ordinary, which is the best thing in the world, ordinary. The house was warm. The beds were set for spring. The trust document was in a fireproof box in the closet, off the hallway, where it had been for 16 months, doing exactly what I'd asked it to do. Some storms you can see coming. You look at the sky, you read the weather, and you do the quiet work before the rain arrives. Derek Wills thought he was walking into an open door. He walked into a wall I'd built a year and a half before he ever knocked.